Hey, what's up, Nashville? I am Beau. This is the What You Need to Know podcast, where we are going to catch you up on 2 weeks of commercial real estate news with an emphasis on Nashville. It certainly will be efficient. I'm going to do my best to also make it educational and perhaps entertaining. So, in that view, let's get started. The first story of the day is our interest rate expectations for 2026, right? So, did you know we had 11 different interest rate adjustments upward during the Joe Biden years? 11 different times the Federal Reserve increased the federal funds rate for a total of 5.25 percentage points in interest, right? So we're still trying to fight off the negative effects of that situation. I don't want to harp too much on that. Perhaps we can cover the history of the Joe Biden years in another podcast. Since Trump did take office, right, we've gotten inflation down to 2.7%. We've had 3 different interest rate cuts totaling 75 basis points. So we are on our way, right? But we're not quite there. So what do we expect to happen in 2026? The federal funds rate is currently restrictive as inflation naturally slides down to 2.3% over the next 3 months. Again, we're at 2.7 now. We expect it to fall all the way to 2.3 on inflation over the next 3 months. To keep policy from accidentally suffocating the economy, the Fed will have to cut rates at least once this spring. What that means is there is a meeting in January. We do not expect an interest rate adjustment in January. But according to our forecast, inflation will be at 2.4% for the March meeting and 2.3% for the April meeting. We expect one cut in March or April, looking at the data, potentially both, if that shelter number really comes down and we flirt with the 2% inflation target. So what that means is, it is known how this inflation calculation is made, right? And some of that inflation calculation is tied to shelter. Shelter is backwards looking. So they're looking quite a ways in the past as opposed to what's happening right now. So if you look at what's happening in terms of shelter costs right now, they are down or somewhat even. So as that kind of that lag kind of makes its way through the inflation calculation, we expect inflation to go down, which is going to give the Fed and outgoing too late Powell the ammunition to make another interest rate adjustment. So we do think we're going to get one in March or April, perhaps both. Both would be at 25 basis points. So that's our interest rate expectations for 2026. We're going to get another one late spring, maybe 2 more, and then we're going to reassess. Going into the year, we were projecting 2 interest rate adjustments for the entire year. So if we do get 2 in spring, that might be it for the year. Let's keep moving. President Trump intends to ban large institutional investors from purchasing single-family homes. And I will tell you, it is my opinion, and don't get me wrong, I'm very much a fan of almost everything the Trump administration has done, especially compared to what we had to endure during the Biden years. So, don't get me wrong on this, but I do believe this is more PR than anything else. I think this is a talking point that sells well with the audience as opposed to a change that's going to materially affect the cost for the first-time home buyer, right? So I think this is more PR than anything. The idea of Wall Street outbidding the average American family for a starter home has been a major frustration for years. The perception is that hedge funds own everything, but the reality is different. Large institutions own roughly 0.5% up to 1% of the total U.S. single-family housing stocks. Let's just keep it real simple. These large institutions own 1% of the total housing stock. So no matter what we do to them, right? No matter where we nudge them, we're still only talking about 1% of the housing stock. Even in the rental market, they control only about 3% of all rental properties. The vast majority of your rental competition is actually mom and pop landlords. Mathematically, banning a buyer that controls less than 1% of the market cannot fix a national affordability crisis. Since late 2022, major institutional players have largely been net sellers, right? So these aren't real active buyers to start with. They are more likely to be net sellers than they are buyers. So if the idea is to make homes more affordable for Americans and to remove the perception that these hedge funds are your competition, right? All that is fine and good, but in reality, the situation is not going to change materially, right? Now, there is something to be said for kind of the national consciousness, right? So if nationally we can get behind this idea that life is getting better and the housing market is getting better, perhaps that leads us to a better place. So perhaps PR in this situation has its value. But in terms of the mathematics of the situation, there's no reason to believe that banning hedge funds from buying single-family homes is going to put any type of downward pressure on home prices. While this ban might lower prices slightly in very, very specific investor-heavy zip codes like Phoenix or Atlanta, it is unlikely to change the math for the vast majority of Americans. The real hurdles remain interest rates, zoning laws, and a decade of underbuilding. Until we solve those, banning the boogeyman is just a PR announcement. So, I think we've covered that pretty substantially. So don't worry too much about the institutional investors and their effect on the single-family housing market. Their effect is very, very minimal. I think they also learn that that is a very difficult business to be in, right? In the game of musical chairs, many of those hedge funds got left without a seat to sit in, and now they're net sellers just kind of licking their wounds and getting out of that business. So, unless you live in a place like Atlanta or Phoenix, this is probably going to have absolutely no effect on your life. But again, from a PR perspective, perhaps it puts a little bit more wind behind our sails and we collectively get a little bit more upbeat about the days ahead. Nashville ranks among the best overall retail markets. Thanks to robust rent growth and low availability, the Sun Belt metropolitan areas ranked as 7 out of the top 10 markets. Nashville lands at number 7 on the list, the same spot as last year. Commonly shared conditions across the top markets include strong population and employment growth, more business-friendly tax and regulation policies, and warm weather. Nashville checks those boxes. Wow, that doesn't seem to be rocket science to me, right? Population growth, employment growth, business-friendly tax and regulations, and warm weather. Yes, sign me up. That is why I'm in Nashville for the most part. Over the past year, Nashville has ranked 3rd in the country for annual asking rent growth, with rents increasing by over 5% last year. So the rents are going up very quickly for retail space in Nashville, the 3rd quickest in the country. A significant factor behind the tight market conditions in Nashville over the past several years has been slowing development. Facts. So many developments stalled out when banks stopped lending money in 2023 and 2024, right? That was the wait and see era. We've now moved past that, and I do think many of these projects are getting teed up once again. But for the last few years, you've got a lot of developers sitting on very, very expensive ground waiting for the opportunity to add some retail stock to our inventory. With 760,000 square feet of retail space under construction, the pipeline currently is 35% below its 10-year average, right? So that speaks to the slowdown in development. The market is likely to remain tight for the foreseeable future. So it is a supply and demand issue. There are more users demanding retail space than there are landlords offering supply of retail space, which is bidding up that space, raising rents, and until we really get that development pipeline rolling again, which I would argue is mostly tied to the willingness of banks to lend money in a reasonable way, we are going to have increasing rental rates. Some of the rents being paid for retail spaces in some of these very niche locations would blow your mind. You know, the 12 South corridor, they're charging over $100 per square foot triple net, so you can sell some overpriced clothing. So, you know, that seems pretty incredible to me. If my wife ever stepped in a store that was paying over $100 per square foot for rent to be there, I would tell her to get the hell out, because everything in there is incredibly overpriced with the biggest profit margins one could ever imagine to support paying such a rent. But that's just me. And good thing that my wife is a very reasonable person and not someone that is going to be overpaying for clothes out of some sense of ego. But we got off track at there. Let's keep moving. Big Loud Records buys a site for its new headquarters. And what makes this story interesting, in my opinion, is the site is not in Music Row and the site is not in Berry Hill. So one of the bigger record producers is buying a site outside of Music Row or Berry Hill. Big Loud Records paid $13.1 million for a Metro Center property that the firm is planning to transform into its corporate headquarters. The Nashville-based music label and management company, which represents big-name artists like Morgan Wallen and Miranda Lambert, is one of several music and entertainment firms who are establishing presences outside the Music Row neighborhood. Located at 601 Main Street Drive, the property about 53,000 square feet on over 7 acres. The one-story building is now empty. The seller of the building paid $5 million for the site in 1987. Big Loud's current Nashville office is located at 111 16th Avenue South. And if you don't recognize that location, that is most definitely Music Row. So this is an interesting development, in my opinion. You've got a big name, management company and music label. You know, I don't want to get it wrong. Music label and management company choosing to locate outside of Music Row in Berry Hill. Berry Hill's got a lot of positive momentum going on the music front. Music Row has a lot going for it besides just music. So I do think it's interesting that Metro Center is where they landed. That'll be interesting to follow. We'll see if that is an ongoing trend. We're in the process of selling a music studio in Berry Hill right now, which has been an interesting project to work on. I've learned very much about the music business in that process, including immediately next to the property that we're working on getting sold is what is arguably known as the top music studio in the country. Blackbird Studios, I'm told by folks that are in the music business that are very, very successful, that is the top music studio in the entire country. There may be one music studio more famous than Blackbird on earth, and that is Abbey Road of Beatles fame. So I thought that was very interesting. You know, the music studios in Berry Hill, you know, they don't look like a whole lot, right? You know, they certainly pump out hits. You know, they have a rich history, right? You're in a community of artists and creators, and there's a vibe there. But just traveling through Berry Hill, where all these music studios are located, you wouldn't necessarily be blown away by what you saw. But nevertheless, the number one music studio in the United States operating in Berry Hill, immediately next to a music studio we're working on getting sold. So if you're in the market for a music studio with a long historic history, reach out to your boy. I'll set you up. Let's keep moving. Nashville office to hotel conversions surge to 2 million square feet, right? So this is a new phenomenon. This is not happening in other markets to the extent that it's happening in Nashville. It's a trend that's been relatively uncommon until the last few years. A shaky office market, multiple distressed sales, and a booming tourism industry have opened the door for developers to take a swing at major conversion projects. Nashville ranks number 3 among the major U.S. markets with a 3.9% of its office inventory eyed for conversion. So that's 3.9% of its total office inventory. The number gets bigger if you look at just downtown, right? That figure is even more staggering for downtown Nashville, which has 13% of its office inventory being eyed for conversion. So that's really the test. 13% of the office space in downtown Nashville is now being eyed for conversion to hotel rooms. New York-based Dreamscape Companies paid $55 million for downtown's Fifth Third Center in August, a price 62% smaller than when it last traded in 2019. They plan a conversion of the building's existing 490,000 square feet of office space into nearly 500 hotel rooms. Scott Borchetta is planning something similar for the 20-story Phillips Plaza Tower. He paid $29 million for the office tower in September and is now planning to convert at least half of it into hotel and Airbnb space. Other major projects include Dolly Parton's conversion of the 211 Commerce building into the Songteller Hotel, as well as a planned conversion of downtown's Parkway Towers office building after its last sale at a $21 million loss. Quote, a lot of the office demand is really leaning more towards the trophy and A-plus creative space. Conversions are really specific to the building, specific to the ownership and how much money they have to either make a building competitive with the office demand right now, or if the building can play in the hotel market here in downtown. Nashville's tourism industry continues to boom, which has led to a spur of new hotel developments across the city like the Pendry Nashville, the Ritz-Carlton in the Gulch, and the Nashville Edition, among many others. Nashville's occupancy within the hotel business continues to lead the entire United States. So I would argue that it has become less desirable to office downtown because of all the craziness related to tourism, right? And because we are the number one hotel market in the country, perhaps it does make logical common sense to convert some of that unwanted office space to hotel rooms. That does seem to be a higher and better use. The only problem with that strategy is somewhere along that line, somebody's got to lose a lot of money for the numbers to pencil out. So you've got landlords that are selling at huge discounts, which is making it possible for buyers to acquire them with the intentions to convert to hotels, because that is very, very costly to do. So for the numbers to work, the seller generally has to lose a lot of money. In years past, right, the sellers were generally the lenders, and they were willing and able to take those losses. Most of the properties being sold at a loss in Nashville, you're seeing the owners, losing their equity, right? Losing all of their equity interest in the property, but you're also seeing their lenders taking a haircut on the notes they have on those properties. Another Brentwood office building sells for a loss. This is becoming kind of a trend in Brentwood, which is a very attractive market, but it's a market that has a lot of aging inventory. Boston-based RMR Group sold the Park Lane office building in Maryland Farms for just over $11 million, marking a nearly 40% loss from what the firm paid just 8 years ago. The buyer in the recent transaction was an LLC tied to Las Vegas-based Logis Commercial Real Estate. The building is located at 5200 Maryland Way in the Maryland Farms Business Park. It's 4 stories and offers over 110,000 square feet of space. So in the Brentwood submarket, you've got a lot of very similar buildings of very similar vintages, right? So that puts you in a tough spot because you don't really have a unique property to offer. Anytime you don't have a unique property to offer, perhaps it's a little older, a little bit more dated, it's kind of a race to the bottom in terms of rents, right? So you either need to upgrade those properties, right, to make them less similar to the competition so you can charge a higher rent, or you've got to just compete on price alone, which is a slow march towards death in the office business. At some point you fall below your break-even occupancy, and then that is a spiral that's very difficult to get out of. Not to mention, many of these owners of office buildings don't really have the cash just sitting around waiting to make these big capital injections. Usually if you're going to upgrade an office building, you go out and borrow money to do that. But, if you're already showing a loss on that property, right, its value is less than what you paid, it's certainly a very difficult situation to go out and borrow money to make those capital improvements. So, I've been in the office building business a long time. That's the business I got into right out of grad school was office towers in downtown Chicago, as a matter of fact. So I learned a lot about that business. It is a very challenging business. You really have to have access to a lot of money. The mom and pop investors generally stay away from office because you need to have access to so much cash, right? You've got to have access to cash to actually build out these spaces called tenant improvements, right? Most of these tenants want improvements made as part of their lease. So you, the landlord, are paying for those improvements on the front end and then recouping that investment over the term of the lease. You've got significant commercial brokerage fees to pay for every new lease. And then you've got those CapEx requirements as well. All of those require access to funds, right? TIs, tenant improvements, commissions, and CapEx. Those are big, big numbers. And if you aren't a big boy with deep pockets or a banking relationship that you can rely on, it is a scary business to be in. Let's keep moving. Local investors buy airport office buildings at a discount. So I don't know if we did this purposely, but we're kind of harping on the idea that there are a lot of people in our market losing money, which isn't necessarily true, right? I would say that when a property owner sells and does take a loss, it makes for big news. But I do think on percentage terms, there are very few properties selling at a loss in Nashville today. Evelyn Capital paid $30 million for a 3-building office complex near the airport. A $12 million loss from the office development's last sale, and the second major discounted deal the group has scored in the past. The Lakeview Place office portfolio offers around 382,000 square feet of office space across 3 buildings. It was 70% leased at time of sale, which a lot of people would say, wow, 70% doesn't sound too bad. Well, If you bought it 95% leased and you sold it 70% leased, that's how you lose $12 million. And we'd have to see how the expenses are passed through to tenants, but your break even, right? Your break even occupancy is probably somewhere between 60 and 70%. So all of your true profit exists above an occupancy above 70%, right? These are just using round numbers so one can kind of think it through. The seller in the recent transaction was Gemini Rosemont, who I have a long relationship with. I used to do a lot of work for Gemini Rosemont, and for whatever reason, they have a long history of selling properties at a loss and or handing the keys back to their lenders, which back when I worked with them was kind of the norm. The recent sale comes around a year after Evelyn Capital bought downtown's Phillip Plaza for $17 million, which was a $94 million loss from its previous sale. The group has since sold Phillips Plaza at a significant markup just 8 months later to Scott Borchetta, who are planning to convert the tower to a hotel, which we just talked about. So this same group that's buying this airport portfolio already bought and flipped Phillips Plaza. The plans with this one are a little bit different. They plan to make immediate capital improvements to modernize Lakeview Place's common areas and amenities to drive leasing velocity for the remaining vacancy. So I would suggest that perhaps the investment thesis here is simply to get that occupancy somewhere near 95% again, right? To do that, one needs to invest some money to modernize the common areas and amenities, right? So that's what I expect to see here. I do not see this being a quick flip. This is a get your hands dirty for 3 to 5 years, and at the end, perhaps you sell it for a price similar to what it sold the time before last, right? Which would lock in a price of about $42 million, right? So you buy it for 30, you lease it up, sell it for 42. Sounds easy, definitely is not easy. And the biggest challenge, in my opinion, maybe this is just the biggest challenge in my life in general, is having a willing lender to finance all of these things, right? So if you've got somebody that will lend you the money, that really changes the game in the office space. If you don't have easy access to funding for these things, it really can be a grind. And like I said, you can get kind of caught in a downward spiral, and it's hard to fight your way back out of it in the office business. Let's keep moving here. I'm going to give you a look ahead. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories to cover. We're about 28 minutes in, so we've got plenty of time to wrap this thing up before the 1 hour that we target. What Trump's marijuana policy shift means for real estate. Y'all might have overlooked this. So there's a lot going on in the Trump presidency. It's hard to keep up with it all. But the president recently signed an executive order reclassifying marijuana to a less dangerous designation. So what does that really mean, right? And that's what we're going to share with you. Cannabis companies and trade groups hailed the decision as one of the most meaningful drug policy changes in decades, but reactions were mixed as to whether it would lead to a sweeping transformation of what is a tightly regulated industry with rules that vary from state to state. Still, Trump's order might eventually help break down barriers in lending, real estate zoning, and property leasing. The most immediate positive effect for legalized cannabis sellers could be a significant decrease in taxes, which I'll explain in a moment. Industry analysts have widely cited high taxes as a significant drag on growth in the legal cannabis sector. Quote, I do think we'll have landlords more willing to lease now that the federal government has said, hey, there's medical value here, which I'll explain in a moment as well. Trump directed Attorney General Pam Bondi to expedite switching marijuana from a Schedule 1 drug to Schedule 3. That moves marijuana out of the grouping it shared with narcotics such as heroin and into the same category as ketamine and anabolic steroids. Schedule 3 drugs are considered to have accepted medical uses. That's the key here. So we're acknowledging that marijuana has accepted medical uses. But Trump's order does not federally legalize marijuana. The legality issue has led banks to resist providing basic financial services to state-authorized cannabis retailers that often only accept cash. It's still going to be a state-by-state game, but now the margins will be better. For the estimated 450,000 people working in the regulated cannabis industry, which seems like a huge amount of people to me, rescheduling is the first domino to fall, paving the way for cannabis to be normalized, respected, and finally treated like any other U.S. industry. The reclassification would nullify Section 280E, a statute of the U.S. tax code that prohibits cannabis sellers from deducting most ordinary business expenses, such as rent, payroll, and utilities, meaning they pay 70% or more in taxes compared with the standard 21% corporate rate. So that's the big thing here, right? This has changed the amount of federal income taxes that these cannabis sellers are going to be paying. So that's number one, right? Also, Stamford, Connecticut-based Curaleaf, right? This is one of the bigger operators in the country, called the Trump administration's action the most impactful federal cannabis reform of the last 50 years. As of August, Curaleaf had 153 U.S. retail locations in 70 states. So they're a heavy hitter that says this is the biggest deal to happen in cannabis in 50 years. So I do think it is meaningful from a tax perspective, right? I also think it just gives some legitimacy to the business of cannabis that perhaps will start to change how lenders and landlords think about those types of businesses. And that's certainly what folks are hoping for. So you haven't heard about it, perhaps, but the biggest deal in cannabis in the last 50 years was just pushed over the finish line by Donald J. Trump. Next, a Jefferson Street property eyed for a project sells. This is interesting because, we've been working to market multiple assets on Jefferson Street, and it has just been a very difficult process. Jefferson Street is known for a corridor that requires gentrification. The challenge with that is the parcels along Jefferson Street are very, very small. 0.1 acres, 0.2 acres, that's kind of the norm. So, most of those properties, it doesn't make a lot of sense to redevelop an individual one. You buy 0.2 of an acre, there's only so much you can do with it, right? So the only projects that have been getting done in Jefferson Street over the last 10 years are those projects that have sophisticated developers assembling parcels, right? So assembling small parcels into larger parcels and then doing ground up development that way. This is the first one that I've heard in a long time that is moving forward. Efforts to reinvent a Jefferson Street site located near Fisk University are progressing. One of the properties needed, one of the small parcels that are being assembled, selling for $700,000, which is actually a very high price for how little ground they're getting. 0.1 acres for $700,000 is a big price. As reported in November of 2024, a 4-story building would offer residential units, some retail space on the ground level, and surface parking. The main address being 1712 Jefferson Street. So this has been planned since all the way back in 2024. They're adding a small parcel to the larger project. The development team is also seeking a 2-floor office and retail building to be located at 1730 Jefferson Street. The development team is led by former Tennessee Titans linebacker Derek Morgan, who just paid $700,000 for the 1734 Jefferson Street property, which will partially accommodate a future office and retail building. A family had owned the 0.1 acre parcel since 1947. The property, offering a building housing Express Pizza in Euros, is located at the northeast corner of the intersection of Jefferson Street and Dr. D.B. Todd Jr. Boulevard. So, that's probably the most high-profile intersection on Jefferson Street. So I would say this is top-of-the-market pricing. I would tell you that this is a project that is taking years to get started. In July of 2024, they paid $1.2 million for 5 parcels, and then paid another $155,000 for another parcel, and they paid $875,000 for yet another 3-parcel lot in 2022. So they've been assembling parcels in this area since 2022. It's now 2026, and perhaps we're actually going to see a shovel in the ground. That's what makes selling property on Jefferson Street so difficult. It's very hard to sell an individual property unless you've got 3 or 4 more adjacent properties willing to join the deal. It's been a very long time since I've seen anyone acquire a single parcel on Jefferson Street and develop that single parcel. They're just not big enough. It doesn't pencil out. So attempting to sell these small parcels individually is an uphill battle if you're a broker. You need some help from the neighboring property owners, and if they aren't willing or able to also join your transaction, you're just in a tough spot. And that's where we've been on the markets, those properties we've been marketing. So let's keep moving. Four Seasons Penthouse, right? So I'm not in the business of residential real estate, but I thought this was a interesting story. Four Seasons Penthouse listed for sale at $33.5 million. How much do you get for your $33.5 million? 5,000 square feet, right? 3 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, $33.5 million. It was recently featured in the Wall Street Journal and is located on the 40th floor. A Malibu, California-based real estate agent, Chris Cortazzo, bought the condo, which was just a white box, for $12 million in 2023. So white box just means, the base building is there, right? The plumbing is there, the electrical is there, the HVAC is there. Now you just need to pick your finishes, right? So he bought the white box for $12 million, spent 2 years completing the residential unit's interior, 2 years to complete the decorative aspects of a 5,000 square foot already constructed condo. So, I don't know what takes 2 years. I don't know how you can justify going from $12 million for the white box to $33 million for the finished product. But golly, the most expensive home ever sold in Nashville was a 50-acre Belmead estate, which sold for $32 million, right? So this is actually priced above the 50-acre Belmead estate that was sold by the HCA Healthcare co-founder Tommy Frist Jr. So we're talking about a ridiculous price. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. A downtown building once housing an Irish pub sells for $5.75 million. The former Mulligan's Pub and Restaurant sold. So if you remember that use, that's kind of the most famous use of this building. It is believed that this sale set the per foot record for 2nd Avenue at $1,272 per square foot. It's only a 2-story building. At 117 2nd Avenue North, it offers no tenant and was formerly home to Benchmark, a sports bar. Benchmark closed following the Christmas Day bombing of 2020. It never reopened. So this building has been vacant for 6 consecutive years. A bomb went off near this location not long ago, and it set the per square foot record for 2nd Avenue. The buyer landed a loan of $4.6 million from Lexington, Tennessee-based Community Bank. A 3rd and 4th floor addition and a renovation to the building are planned. So I guess that's how you can make this thing pencil out, is that sure, you're buying 2 floors, but you're adding 3 and 4 floors. They haven't announced what ultimately will be done here, but I think you can pretty much guess that it will be targeted towards tourism and overpriced alcoholic beverages. The seller paid $4.7 million in 2022 for the building, which offers about 4,500 square feet and opened in the late 1800s. At the time, the transaction set a local per square foot record of just over $1,000. So this is the second time they've set a record for 2nd Avenue. For context, a building located at 127 2nd Avenue North sold earlier this month for $8.6 million, the equivalent of $1,265 per square foot. This shows the strength and resilience of 2nd Avenue, having experienced the devastating event of the 2020 Christmas Day bombing, and with the new street now reopened and its buildings selling for top prices. So, they had patient money, right? They had patient money to wait until all of the work on 2nd Avenue was complete, and then to sell at record-breaking prices. I'm not sure they would do it all over again, having paid $4.7 million in 2022 and then just carried that vacant building until 2026 to resell for $5.7. Maybe so. They probably would. It always surprises me, the willingness for these buyers to carry these very, very costly projects for a number of years where you have negative cash flow every month for years. I'm just not wired to do that. And every time I see it, I'm just shocked by it. I don't fully understand it. Do we have that much cash in the bank where funding a negative cash flow property every month for years is not something that keeps us up at night? Did somehow we negotiate in a banking relationship where you've got some type of line of credit that's covering that shortfall for years, and then once you finally sell and pay off that line, there's still some left over for you? I don't know how they're doing it. Maybe I just don't have the guts. But carrying negative cash flow properties for years on end when you're paying those types of prices to this day is still shocking to me. So now we're going to finish out today's podcast. I appreciate everybody hanging in there with me. Let me get a little bit of caffeine to push me over the edge here. I'm going to give you 8 projects to watch in 2026. This is going to be quick, fast-paced. 8 projects to keep your eye on this year, and then we'll wrap up the show. Paramount, the 60-story, $460 million apartment and condo tower broke ground this past fall and is going to offer 360 apartments and 140 condos. It will be Tennessee's tallest tower at 1010 Church Street, adjacent to the transformative Nashville Yards development, where much of the downtown action is being drawn to. Yeah, very, very good location. You aren't going to be able to miss this tower because once it tops out, it's going to be the tallest tower not only in Nashville, but in the state of Tennessee. Belmead Village. Nashville-based AJ Capital Partners is starting work on Belmead Village, a 15.5-acre mixed-use development on the site of the former Belmead Plaza. The project is expected to transform the gateway to the wealthy West Nashville neighborhood, where several other developments are in motion. Oracle's River North campus. The firm is picking up speed on its 80-acre campus that now comes with a $4.5 billion price tag spanning 2.7 million square feet of building space. They recently announced a luxury Nobu hotel as part of the project that will anchor the north end of the East Bank area that is undergoing a massive revitalization. Though an official groundbreaking has not been revealed, Oracle has submitted permits and is actively hiring roles for its Nashville campus construction. The Pendry Nashville. Nashville has seen a slew of hotel and condo development announcements over the last year, but the Pendry Nashville in the Gulch is one of the few to actually break ground. Samara Road is leading development of the 30-story Pendry branded tower, which will offer 180 hotel rooms and 146 condos in the firm's Paseo South Gulch development. The Fallon Company's East Bank development. It's been more than 2 years since Metro selected the Fallon Company to build 30 acres of mixed-use development surrounding the new Tennessee Titans Stadium. But 2026 is when you'll see the first buildings rise. So imagine this company, Fallon Company. For 2 years, they've been working on designing this 30 acres. Money going out for 2 straight years, and still nowhere close to having a project completed on the site, and nowhere close to having any type of positive cash flow to cover any of those expenses. That's the developers don't get enough credit for their willingness to take losses for years at a time, right? Developers have a bad reputation for, getting rich, right? Getting rich through gentrification and big bad developers. No. Developers have real guts, right? They have real guts that allow them to take on big risky projects and be cash flow negative for years at a time, hoping that one day the ultimate sale of that property will pay off all of the money they've invested and there will be a profit left over at the end. It's crazy that anybody would have hatred for developers. What a difficult and scary business. East Point is what they're now calling this East Bank development. Expect to see a 323-unit affordable housing development, as well as 2 other towers, residential and a hotel, begin to rise next to the $2.1 billion stadium development soon. So 3 buildings should be coming out of the ground soon. The Motley is one of many major projects in Midtown's pipeline, but it's one of the few that have made movement after a slew of announcements in 21 and 22. Bosa Properties broke ground on the first of 3 towers planned for the former dairy factory property this year, which is planned to offer 326 residential units. So again, these are projects that were announced in 21 and 22 and are just breaking ground in 26. The East Bank Scrapyard. 2025 was the year when a local investor group took control of the longtime East Bank Scrapyard, buying it from billionaire Carl Icahn for $245 million, a mammoth real estate deal in both price and historical significance. They've since rebranded the 47 acres of prime riverfront property to, quote, the East Bend. Development plans that could include towers up to 40 stories high. They are nowhere near getting anything started in that scrapyard project. Another $245 million for the dirt that they're going to carry for years before a building goes vertical on that, what will be very, very valuable land, but there's so far to go. I wouldn't even know how to begin to understand how they are financing that. Wedgwood Village. AJ Capital Partners has spent the last decade transforming the Wedgwood, Houston neighborhood from an industrial pocket to an artistic hotspot. And several new developments will build on that momentum this year. Joining their 18-acre Wedgwood Village development in 2026 will be Live Nation music venue called The Truth, which I think is a fun name, and a new apartment and retail building, all while the firm continues to work on several new office buildings and development surrounding its historic Merritt Mansion. So those are the 8 projects to watch in 2026. It is going to be a big year. I will tell you that we are advising our clients and prospective clients that 2026 will be the best year to be the seller of commercial real estate since all the way back in 2022, right? 23 and 24 are when banks stopped lending. We had all of the madness related to inflation and all the mismanagement at the federal level. We've since kind of worked through that. 2025 was very choppy, but even 2025, banks lended 50% more than they did in 2024. So we're trending in the right direction. We need to get lenders interested in lending money again. As soon as we do, many of these projects that have been stalled out since Biden took office are going to get started. We're going to see a lot more properties trading, and it's all going to come down to banks' eagerness to lend money. And I think we're really on the way to being there. I think sentiment in the market is good. I think we have some positivity related to kind of the trajectory that our country is on. We certainly have a lot positive to say about Tennessee and how it operates itself, and also the growth story we have in Metro Nashville. So I do think 2026 is going to be a great year to be a seller of commercial real estate. We're excited about getting back to a business that is booming again. You know, it has been quite a grind for a number of years, and we're very much looking forward to a different experience this year. So thank you all so much for tuning in. As always, our podcast is brought to you by Beechwood Commercial Real Estate Brokerage, your broker for sellers of commercial real estate in Nashville and the Southeast. If there's anything we could ever do for you regarding you and your property, I encourage you to reach out to us. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you again real soon.